For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 352nd Artillery Regiment, the morning began like any other on the Normandy coast. A thin, damp mist hung over the English Channel, muffling the world in a gray stillness. The air was cold, filled with the familiar scent of salt and wet earth. It was just after 5 a.m. Another watch, another day of anxious waiting. But through his binoculars, as the first hint of dawn tried to break the horizon, the sea began to change. It wasn't the tide. It wasn't a weather front. It was something impossible. A dark line had appeared where sea met sky, a smudge that just kept growing, sharpening, and multiplying. This wasn't a fleet. It was a city of steel, a floating metropolis sailing out of the mist and into history. At that moment, before a single Allied soldier set foot on the beaches below, before the world even knew the name Omaha or Utah, he knew the Reich was about to drown. To understand the shock of that morning, you have to get inside the mindset of Fortress Europe in the spring of 1944. From the coast of Norway down to the Spanish border, German engineers had built the Atlantic Wall. It was conceived as a chain of concrete and steel, bristling with guns, an impenetrable barrier against any invasion. In the minds of German high command, and in the propaganda fed to the soldiers, it was proof of the Reich's power. But Oberleutnant Richter, a professional soldier and a veteran of the Eastern Front, knew the difference between propaganda and reality. At 32, he was old enough to remember a different Germany and young enough to have been shaped by the furnace of the war. He was pragmatic, observant, and deeply tired. His command was an artillery battery with solid checkmate cannons nestled in concrete casements a few miles inland from the beaches the Allies would soon codeem Omaha. From his observation post, a concrete bunker sunk into a high bluff. He had a commanding view of the sea. Day after day, he and his men drilled. They calculated firing solutions, maintained their guns, and stared out at the gray empty water. The talk was always of the invasion, Dare Tag X, the day of days. But when would it come, and more importantly, where? German intelligence was certain the main attack would come at the pad, the shortest point across the channel. It was the logical choice. That's where the 15th Army, the bulk of Germany's strength in the West, was waiting. Normandy was considered a sideshow, maybe a spot for a diversion, but not the main event. This was a massive strategic miscalculation, and it was no accident. It was the result of a brilliant Allied deception campaign called Operation Fortitude, and it left the Normandy defenders dangerously exposed. Our Tours unit, the 352nd Infantry Division, was better than most in the area, but it was still just a shadow of the elite forces that had conquered France 4 years earlier. It was a mix of seasoned veterans from the East like himself, and a larger number of very young teenage conscripts and older reservists. They were brave and dutiful, but they weren't the stormtroopers of 1940. They were defenders tasked with holding a line that was stretched far too thin. The Atlantic Wall itself was more of a patchwork than a solid wall. Many bunkers were incomplete. Minefields had gaps. The vast distances meant even a powerful strongpoint could be isolated and bypassed. Richter knew this. He had seen the shortcuts local farmers still used, the blind spots in the fields of fire. He had a professional skepticism about their chances against a truly determined assault. In the weeks leading up to June, the tension had been a living thing. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with improving the defenses, had been a whirlwind of activity. He ordered millions of mines and thousands of jagged steel obstacles placed on the beaches. The men called them Rommel's asparagus. Rommel understood a truth that the high command in Berlin seemed to ignore. If the Allies weren't defeated on the beaches in the first 24 hours, the war in the West would be lost. Allied air power would shred any German reinforcements trying to move to the coast. The first day was the only day that mattered. But on June 5th, the weather turned. A storm blew in with high winds and rough seas. The German Meteorological Office confidently predicted an invasion would be impossible for days. This forecast allowed many senior officers to relax. It was why Rommel himself wasn't even in France. He had gone home to Germany for his wife's birthday. The storm would keep them safe. So, as Artur stood watch in the pre-dawn chill of June 6th, the mood was routine. The storm had passed, but the sea was still choppy. No one expected a thing. He was looking east when he first saw it. A flicker. He raised his powerful Zeiss binoculars and focused. His heart, which had been beating in the slow rhythm of a night watch, began to hammer against his ribs. It wasn't a flicker. It was ships, not a patrol, not a raiding party.
Hundreds of them.
And behind them more and more still. He swept his binoculars left and right. Everywhere he looked, it was the same. The sea was no longer gray water. It was a solid mass of dark, menacing shapes. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. It was the feeling of a man looking at a math problem he could not possibly solve. For a long moment, Artur just couldn't process it. The sheer scale was an insult to logic. German intelligence had estimated the Allies might muster 3,000 vessels for an invasion, and even that would have been a monumental effort. What he was looking at was something else entirely. He tried to count, but it was a fool's errand. His brain, on instinct, began to categorize. He could make out the hulking silhouettes of battleships and cruisers. He saw swarms of smaller, faster destroyers circling them like wolves. And then there were the others, the endless, uncountable others. Landing craft of all shapes and sizes, packed so densely they looked like iron filings drawn to a magnet. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The image didn't change. It only grew clearer as the sun began its slow climb. The official number for the entire operation would later be confirmed at nearly 7,000 vessels, an armada from 8 different nations. It remains the largest amphibious invasion force in history. But to Artur, it wasn't a statistic. It was a physical presence that seemed to bend the horizon. It was a declaration of industrial power so immense that it made everything he'd ever known about warfare obsolete. Germany had built a wall of concrete. The Allies had responded by building a bridge of steel. He grabbed the field telephone, his hands slick with sweat.
This is Artur at Observation Post 4.
I have a visual on the channel.
There are ships.
The voice on the other end was tired, dismissive.
We have reports of a few ships over Leutnant. A possible raid. Stand by?
No.
Archer's voice was strained.
Urgent. You don't understand.
It's not a few ships.
It is thousands.
The entire sea is covered from horizon to horizon.
This is it. This is the invasion.
There was a pause.
Disbelief.
Artur could almost hear the man picturing him as a hysterical junior officer spooked by shadows. Over Oberleutnant,
the sea conditions are not suitable. Our reports show your reports are wrong.
Artur shouted, his voice cracking.
I'm looking at it with my own eyes.
For God's sake, look at the sea.
He slammed the phone down in frustration. It was too big to be believed. He tried another line to regimental headquarters and found his commanding officer.
Artur here, sir. The invasion fleet is here. 10,000 ships.
He knew he was exaggerating, but in that moment, it felt like an understatement. The major's voice was skeptical.
Artur, are you certain?
The weather.
The weather is clear enough to see the end of the world, Major, and it is sitting in the English Channel, requesting permission to open fire.
This time, the urgency cut through. The chain of command was paralyzed by a failure of imagination. Their plans, their maps, their intelligence reports, all of it was being erased by the reality floating a few miles away. While Artur was watching the fleet, the high command was focused on reports of parachutists inland, assuming they were the main event.
No one was looking at the sea.
Artur didn't wait for them. He shouted orders to his men. Roused by the commotion, they stared out from their positions, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. They saw what he saw.
The drills were over.
This was real. The heavy shells were brought up from the magazines. Rangefinders called out numbers that seemed impossibly large. The giant barrels of the cannons, silent for so long, elevated slowly, pointing their noses toward the impossible fleet. Artur stood in his post, binoculars pressed to his eyes. He could see the landing craft beginning to form up. He could feel the vibration in the air. A low hum of thousands of engines. It was the sound of a superpower breathing, and he was about to throw the first stone. The order finally came just before 6 a.m. Engage at will. For Artur, it was a release. The paralysis of disbelief was broken by the familiar clarity of action.
Fire!
He roared into the telephone. A moment later, the ground trembled as the first gun fired. Then a second and a third. The shells screamed out over the water. Artur tracked them through his binoculars, a surge of professional pride mixing with his dread. He saw plumes of water erupt in the midst of the fleet. A miss, then another.
His men were good.
They adjusted their aim, firing with a disciplined rhythm. And for a brief moment, they made their mark. Artur saw a direct hit on an American destroyer, the USS Corey. There was a flash of orange and a puff of black smoke. While some accounts suggest the ship may have also struck a mine, from Artur's perspective, his guns had drawn first blood as the ship listed, crippled, and later sinking. A cheer went up from his men. For a few minutes, it felt like a real battle. It felt like their training mattered. But the feeling was fleeting because after the Corey was hit, the fleet did not scatter. It didn't slow down. The gap in the formation was simply filled. The endless lines of ships kept coming. An iron tide that couldn't be stopped. His guns fired again and again. But for every one ship they might harass, 100 sailed past untouched. Artur felt a profound sense of futility wash over him. He was a man with a bucket trying to empty the ocean. He looked past his own shell impacts and saw the larger picture. The Allied battleships, ships like the USS Texas, were now turning their massive 14-inch guns toward the shore. Then came the reply. It started as a low rumble from across the water. He saw flashes of light from the big ships, like a silent lightning storm on the horizon. A few seconds later, the air around him began to tear itself apart. The ground began to heave. Geysers of earth erupted from the fields. The systematic industrial process of dismantling the Atlantic Wall had begun. Where was the German response? Where were the panzers? Where was the Luftwaffe? Artur scanned the skies and saw nothing but Allied planes, fighters, bombers, transports. They owned the air completely. German doctrine called for armored counterattacks. But the closest armored unit, the 21st Panzer Division, was paralyzed by confusion and the need for a direct order from Hitler's headquarters. When it finally did move, it moved without air cover into a sky black with Allied fighter bombers, and it was decimated before it even reached the front. It was in that moment with his own guns firing and the sky raining steel that Artur understood this wasn't a fight. It was an extermination. The Allies weren't trying to outmaneuver him. They were trying to erase him. This single personal realization of overwhelming force defined the entire Normandy campaign. The story of how industrial might eclipse battlefield tactics is complex and fascinating. If you find these deep dives into the lesser-known perspectives of history compelling, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. It allows us to continue bringing these crucial human stories to light. As the naval bombardment intensified, something in Artur's mind shifted. The tactical part of his brain shut down. It was replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. He was no longer seeing ships and soldiers. He was seeing the system behind them. He was seeing the factories. Through his trembling binoculars, he looked past the warships and saw in his mind's eye the assembly lines of Detroit. He pictured factories churning out trucks and engines on a scale Germany could only dream of. The logistics of this invasion, the ability to supply hundreds of thousands of men on a hostile shore, wasn't a miracle. It was a simple result of that industrial output. He looked at the sky filled with an endless stream of C-47 transport planes and fighter bombers. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe flew maybe 300 sorties in all of France. The Allies flew over 14 down. For every one German plane in the sky, there were more than 40 Allied ones. The reason wasn't a failure of German courage. It was the factories. And then there were the tanks. He knew the reputation of the German panzers. The Tiger and the Panther were technologically superior, feared by Allied crews. But that superiority was a strategic dead end. They were complex, expensive, and difficult to produce. For every fearsome Tiger tank that rolled off the line, the Allies were stamping out dozens of simpler but brutally effective Sherman tanks. In the entire year of 1944, the US alone would produce over 29,000 tanks. Germany's peak monthly production, by contrast, never topped 2,000. The Allies weren't planning to win tank battles through quality. They were planning to win by burying the panzers under a mountain of steel. This was the new reality. This was the industrial equation of defeat. All the talk of willpower and ideological strength dissolved in the face of these numbers. Nazi ideology had promised that a unified, determined people could triumph over decadent democracies. But here was the proof that ideology couldn't stop a bomber. Willpower couldn't sink a battleship. Artur felt a profound, almost spiritual despair. He and his men were good soldiers. They were about to die, not because they were outfought, but because they were outnumbered on a scale that defied comprehension. They were participants in a contest that was already over. He and his men, the entire German army in the West, were like a finely crafted sword facing a steam-powered drop hammer. The outcome of the contest was never in doubt. He thought of the propaganda posters and the unshakable belief back home in final victory. It was all a lie. Not just a political lie, but a mathematical one.
The German High Command must have known. They must have seen the production charts.
Yet, they had sent him and millions of others to fight a war they could not possibly win. It's no wonder that in the war's final year, the psychological strain and the confrontation with this impossible truth led to a rise in suicides among officers on the front lines. They weren't just fighting soldiers from America, Britain, and Canada. They were fighting the full unrestrained power of the global industrial complex. As the sun climbed higher, the theoretical became a brutal reality. The naval bombardment reached a crescendo, a constant rolling thunder that never ceased. The concrete of the bunker shuddered, dust raining from the ceiling. Through the observation slit, Artur saw the first waves of landing craft hit the shore. Higgins boats dropped their ramps, disgorging American soldiers into the surf. The machine guns in the German pillboxes along Omaha Beach began to chatter, tearing into the ranks of the first men ashore. From his vantage point, Artur could see the terrible drama unfold, the water turning red, the bodies piling up. The German 352nd Infantry Division was exacting a horrific price. For a moment, it seemed the defense was holding.
The Americans were pinned down.
But then the industrial equation asserted itself again. Allied destroyers, seeing the slaughter, did something suicidal and heroic. They steamed directly towards the shore, some closing to within 1,000 yards, scraping their hulls on sandbars. They turned their guns on the German bunkers, providing direct fire support in a move that turned the tide on Omaha. At the same time, strange new machines began to appear. Artur watched as amphibious trucks, the DUKWS, seemingly drove directly out of the ocean and onto the beach. He saw tanks crawling ashore, some equipped with giant flails to detonate mines. These were Hobart's funnies, specialized armored vehicles the British had developed to overcome exactly these kinds of defenses.
The Germans had nothing like them.
The scene on the beach below turned from a struggle into a methodical process of annihilation. German strongpoints were systematically blinded and destroyed by naval shells, tank rounds, and bombs. On Omaha Beach alone, estimates suggest the 3rd Division would suffer somewhere around 1,200 casualties that day. A staggering percentage of its fighting force wiped out in a matter of hours. Artur's own battery was now a prime target. Shells landed closer and closer. A direct hit on one of the gun pits sent a fireball into the air.
Another gun was knocked out.
His telephone lines went dead. He was isolated. His command shattered. He looked up at the sky one last time. It was a moving ceiling of Allied aircraft. On the sea, the first wave of landing craft was being replaced by a second and a third. Beyond them, the vast armada waited patiently. A conveyor belt of men and material that could, it seemed, run forever. The Allies would land around 1,100 tanks on D-Day alone. The battle for the beach was still raging, but the outcome had already been decided. It was just a matter of time and tonnage. The war in Normandy would rage for another 2 months. The fighting in the hedge would be brutal and costly, but it would change nothing. Every German tank destroyed was a loss that could not be replaced. Every Allied tank lost was replaced by 3 more. Every German soldier who fell left a gap in the line that could not be filled. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, and for the thousands of German soldiers who survived that first day, the rest of the war was just an epilogue. They fought on driven by duty, by fear, or by a patriotism disconnected from reality. But the hope of victory was gone. It had vanished in the dawnlight of June 6th. We often picture the end of the Third Reich as a slow, agonizing collapse culminating in the battle for Berlin. But for the men on the Atlantic Wall, the end came in a single horrifying moment of revelation. It was the moment they saw a fleet that filled the horizon, a sky black with enemy planes, and a force that was not just an army, but the full crushing weight of the modern industrial world. It was a new kind of war, one not in the hearts of soldiers, but on the assembly lines of factories thousands of miles away. And for one German officer peering through his binoculars at a sea that had turned to steel, it was the morning he knew it was. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more forgotten battles, hidden histories, and untold soldier stories to life.
And let me know your thoughts in the comments. What event or perspective would you like to see next? I read every comment.